I was working the night shift as a security guard at a condo building about 10 years ago. It was a large building downtown, so even though I was there almost every night, there were still a lot of people who I wouldn't recognize. Short-term rentals were banned there, but we had caught some people running Airbnbs out of their unit, so that was a possible reason. The job was mostly quiet, especially after midnight. My setup included a small desk, equipped with monitors linked to the building's security cameras. It was near the main entrance. This allowed me to keep an eye on both the screens and the front glass doors. From where I was sitting, I could see people coming up to the main entrance and come in. I would look up most times out of instinct, but usually didn't do anything. Most nights, the hardest part was to stay awake. It was especially hard because I always worked alone. It's important to mention that there were two other ways to get into the building. Residents could come in through a side and back entrance as well. There were cameras on those doors, but no security guards. One night in June, everything was normal until around 1 a.m. I was scrolling through my phone, half listening to the hum of the city outside. It was a weekend, so things were a little more vibrant than usual. The building was not far from some of the city's nightlife, so you would hear sirens, parties, screaming, and that kind of stuff. Suddenly, I saw a movement out of the corner of my eye. I looked up and saw a man standing at the front door, just a single guy. I didn't recognize him and thought he was probably in his early 20s. He was wearing a red baseball hat backwards and a vintage-looking jacket, maybe a 1990s baseball team or something. He knocked on the glass, catching my attention, and then started gesturing towards the intercom. I stood up and approached the door, which was just a big solid piece of glass. He explained that he was there to visit a friend. I asked for the friend's name and apartment number, standard procedure for late-night visitors, but he hesitated and mumbled some response that didn't make sense. Typically, people would just buzz their guests up without my help, but if they couldn't figure out the system, then I could help them out. I couldn't just let in random strangers, though, for obvious reasons. I explained that to him, and he didn't take it well. He argued with me for a minute, but when he realized that I wouldn't let him in, he cussed me out a bit and kinda got in my face from the other side of the glass. It was funny watching him try to intimidate me through a closed door, and then the guy walked away. I watched him disappear down the street before returning to my desk. The adrenaline from that confrontation faded away after a while, and I soon forgot about it. It wasn't that unusual so far, because there were some crazy people around. I kept an occasional eye on the monitors, but mostly I was staring at my phone, just playing some game. An hour slipped by before I knew it, and the next time I checked the clock, it was past 2 in the morning. Suddenly, I felt a presence near me and maybe heard some footsteps. I looked up startled, and there he was, that same man from before. He had gotten inside somehow without me noticing. He was standing over me, and the smell of alcohol was hard to ignore. "Can I help you?" I asked. "You could have helped me before, but how did that go?" he slurred. He put his hands on the desk and leaned in. His eyes were bloodshot, and I knew he was both drunk and very angry. I picked up the phone to dial the police. As soon as he realized what I was doing, he lunged across the desk, his hands grabbing for the phone. The situation escalated faster than I could process. Before I could fully react, he had grabbed the phone out of my hand. The force of his tug caught me off guard, and I stumbled forward in my chair. I caught myself on the desk, but my knee hit the ground, and it hurt. His fist then connected with my jaw, and I fell to the ground completely. The room spun around me as I lay there, but I was really worried that he was going to come over to my side. As I tried to regain my bearings on the floor, he must have jumped over the desk and started kicking me. I shielded my head with my arms as best I could, but he was getting through, and I knew I was taking a lot of shots. I didn't know how long I could stay conscious, and if I passed out, then I could be in real danger. I was pretty out of it for most of the time, but somebody saw what was happening and scared him away. It was just another person passing by, but they may very well have saved my life. Once my attacker was gone, the other guy called the cops. When they got there, I told them what the guy looked like, and they checked our cameras. He was caught later in the night. After that, an ambulance arrived to check on me. Paramedics took a look at some of my cuts and recommended a follow-up with a doctor for my jaw. It was a close call, and it left me feeling more vulnerable than I cared to admit. The officers returned briefly to take my statement and informed me that the man had a criminal record for assault and robbery. They also told me that he didn't actually know anybody in the building. I'm not sure how they knew that, but maybe they interrogated him. So it seems like some random criminal tried to break into the building and rob the place. As for how he got in, they were able to tell that he snuck in after one of the residents opened the side door. If I was watching on the cameras, then I would have seen it, but I was staring at my phone when he came in. Since it was over an hour since our first encounter at the front door, we know that he was probably out there waiting the whole time. Also, he could beat the crap out of me for not letting him in. Needless to say, he was a dangerous guy, easily capable of ending me. This story dates back quite a few years, but it's still the worst one that I have from when I was a taxi driver. It was the year 2011, and I was living in New Jersey, which is where I grew up. Nights can be rough out there, and lots of things have happened. Rude passengers are common. One time, two guys got into a fight in my back seat, and I almost crashed into a lamppost because of the distraction. This story's about something much worse, though. I was driving during the night shift, which I had been doing for a few years at the time. That night, it was pretty busy early on, but things quieted down as the night got late. That was usual, but there was always enough work to keep me busy. It was around 1 a.m., and I was driving around a mostly deserted street after dropping off a passenger. I was on until 6 in the morning, so nowhere near calling it a night. That trip had taken me out into one of the suburbs, so I was out of the city. It was a Sunday night, so the suburbs were pretty empty at that hour. Being that I knew the area quite well, there was a shortcut that I would sometimes use. It was a small single-lane highway that I knew would be mostly empty for the way back. My estimate was that it would save me around 10 minutes, so I took it. For a while, I didn't see any other cars at all, but when I got closer to the city, there was some other traffic. That was when I saw something that made me slow down. There was a car stopped at the side of the road. From a distance, it was just a pair of red taillights that I could see on the side of the road, but when I got closer, I realized that it was two cars. One was a smaller silver car, and the other was a dark SUV. The weird thing, though, was that the SUV was in the middle of the road, blocking the single lane. It had all of its lights off, which must have been why I didn't see it right away. I stopped my car about 30 feet back, because I couldn't pass the SUV blocking the road. I was still wondering what was going on. The street was dim, but I could make out a man leaning into the driver's side window of the silver car. I was kind of far back, but I could still tell that there was yelling, and then I thought I heard crying. From what I was seeing, it looked like a robbery or maybe a carjacking. The only other possibility that I could think of was that the black SUV was an unmarked police car, but that didn't seem likely. Either way, it made sense to call for help. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police. I was keeping my eyes on the situation as I spoke quietly into the phone. The operator answered, and I explained what I was witnessing, providing the street name and describing both vehicles involved. As I was talking, the inside of the silver car suddenly lit up, and a loud bang echoed down the street. My heart jumped. I thought somebody had been shot. I crouched lower in my seat, phone still pressed to my ear, straining to see what was happening without being noticed. The dispatcher asked me to stay on the line and keep updating them with any changes. My hands were shaking, the phone almost slipping from my grasp. Right then, I turned off my engine and lights, hoping not to be noticed. From my vantage point, I could see the man still leaning into the car. The crying had stopped, which worried me even more than the noise had. A few tense moments passed, then the interior light of the car flicked off. With that, I could barely see anything. Both cars and the man that I had seen were just dark shadows up ahead. I didn't think they knew I was there, though, so at least I had that. All the while, I was still talking to the operator on 911. He told me that the police were close, and soon after, sirens became faintly audible in the distance. The man outside the car abruptly straightened up, glanced around, and then jumped into the back seat of the black SUV. I could just barely see all of that in the moonlight. The SUV sped off, just as the sirens began to sound close. All the while, that silver car was still there at the side of the road. I didn't know if there was somebody hurt in there. I wanted to go and check, but I thought it was better to stay away, especially because help was so close. The flashing lights of police cars then appeared around the corner. One of them chased after the SUV as it disappeared down the street. Another police car and an ambulance pulled up to the scene where I was waiting. I was relieved when the police approached, and then the paramedics followed. I could also see a fair way down the highway, and not that far up ahead, where the road bent sharply, the police managed to pull the SUV over. I could see the officers quickly surrounding the car. I really wanted to get out of there, but I knew that I was a witness, so I had to stay around. Even after 5 or 10 minutes, nobody came to talk to me though. I thought the police hadn't even noticed me, so I turned on my lights just so they could see me. Within seconds, one of the police cars sped over to me and yelled at me to stay there. I thought that was rude, but I guess they were under a lot of stress. That only made me worry more for whoever was in that silver car. I was pretty sure somebody had been shot. I waited as patiently as I could, and it wasn't long before I saw a person being loaded into the ambulance. It drove off, and then one of the cop cars came to talk to me. Since I witnessed part of the robbery, I had to give my account. I told them what I knew. I later found out that the person in the silver car was shot that night. That was all I knew at the time, and then the cops let me go. All I know other than that is what was available in the local news. It turned out that it was indeed a carjacking gone wrong. The victim survived, and the perpetrators were both caught that night. I've seen robberies before, but this is the only one where a gun was actually fired. I can't even describe the feeling of fear when that bang went off. Even from the distance I was at, it felt like it was right in my ear. I don't think I'll ever forget that sound. About 10 years ago, I'd been working the night shift at a gas station in a small town. I only worked there for several months. The job was straightforward. I handled the register, stocked shelves, and kept the place tidy from 8 p.m. until 6 a.m. The town only had about 1,000 people, but there was a main highway that went right through it, so a lot of the people there were passing through. I had to drive a few towns over to get there. It wasn't ideal, but jobs were scarce closer to home. The drive was about 45 minutes each way. The gas station was a small building, with just a couple pumps and a small convenience store, which is where I worked. It was open all night, as most gas stations are, but this one was not that busy at night. That meant that I was the only employee on, which could get eerie, but nothing truly odd ever happened before this. Most nights were spent reading or watching stuff on my phone. The occasional customer would come in and interrupt me, but it was really only a few per hour at the most. One night at around 4 in the morning, I was restocking shelves at the back of the store. I always put that work off until the end of the night for some reason. Procrastination, I guess. That was when I saw headlights pull into the station. I glanced out the window and noticed a police car. It wasn't unusual for the local cops to drop by and grab a coffee. They worked all night just like me, and I knew some of the cops from that town. Highway patrol was different though, and they were usually not familiar. For whatever reason, this car looked different. It was marked as a highway patrol, which wasn't that strange, but the design didn't quite match the usual patrol cars that I was used to seeing around there. I thought it might have been an older model or something, so I didn't give it any more thought at the time. The door chimed as the officer entered. He was a tall man with a thick mustache and sunglasses, even though it was dark outside. He didn't acknowledge me as he entered. I nodded to him, but I don't think he even saw me. It was surprisingly cold, especially because cops were usually really friendly. He started walking down the aisles, seemingly looking at some things, but not picking anything up. I continued to work, glancing at him occasionally. At one point, he looked like he was on his phone, but I never heard him say a word. It was an awkward and tense couple of minutes with him there. He roamed the small store for a while, and then left as quietly as he entered. He never said a word and didn't buy anything, not even gas. The whole encounter felt off, but I didn't know what to make of it. I was just glad when he was gone. After the officer left, the remaining hours of my shift dragged on slowly. I was tired by then, so I went over to the coffee machine and poured myself one, probably my third or fourth of the night. My shift finally ended, and I was relieved when one of my coworkers came in to take over. We talked for a few minutes, and I told him about the weird cop. He thought it was strange as well, but nothing to get worked up over. Then I headed outside and walked towards my car, which was around the side of the building. The sky was beginning to lighten. The streetlights were still on, but the sun was almost up. I began to drive back home. The roads were almost empty, except for the occasional early morning trucker. I was about 10 minutes away on the road when I saw a car behind me. It was close, and just on my tail. It was so close, in fact, that I could tell that it was a police car. I was pretty sure that it was the same patrol car that had came in earlier to the gas station. Knowing there was a cop back there, I was driving extra carefully and watching my speed. I thought he was trying to trap me for speeding, so I was being really careful. After a few minutes of tailing me, he turned on his lights and pulled me over. I stopped on the side of the road and rolled down my window. The officer approached, still wearing his sunglasses. "Where are you headed?" he said flatly. "Just going home, sir," I replied cautiously, not wanting any trouble. He just stared at me for a moment, and then said, "You were speeding back there," again very cold. I knew that I wasn't speeding, but there was no point in getting into an argument with a cop. I didn't admit anything, but I didn't deny it either. I was hoping he would give me a ticket, and then I could fight it later. We talked a bit more, but I kept my answers short and to the point. Eventually, he said that he was going to let me off with a warning. Then he walked back to his car, which was behind mine, but it didn't move. I sat there puzzled and unnerved. Why had he stopped me if only to give me a warning? And why had he followed me? I also realized that he never even asked for my license. I turned my engine on and started driving again, but as soon as I was back on the road, I noticed that police car was behind me again. It was like he was following me. He kept his distance this time, not like it was before. Even still, the more I thought about it, the less it felt right. This wasn't normal police behavior, and something about that officer just didn't sit right with me. He didn't seem right for all kinds of reasons, and it was starting to feel like he was a fake cop. I was still heading home, but the idea of leading this potential fake cop to where I lived was scary. Then I remembered that there was a police station in the next town over. It seemed like the safest option. If he was a real cop, then he would have no issue going there. If he wasn't, then it might scare him off. I made a quick decision to change my route. I turned off towards that town, checking my mirror. The car followed me. My heart was pounding as I drove the last few miles to the police station. Eventually, it came into view. As I neared it, I saw that patrol car behind me slow down and fade into the distance. When I pulled into the station's parking lot and looked back, the car was gone. I parked and sat there for a while, but after a few minutes, I gathered enough courage to go inside. I explained to the desk officer what happened, from the odd visit at the gas station to being followed, and then the encounter on my drive home. He asked for a description of the man in the car. I did that, and then I left soon after. Over the next few days, I kept an eye on the news and checked in with the police, but there were no updates on the mysterious officer. Whether he was a real cop with odd methods, or somebody impersonating one, I'm not sure, but I never saw him again. After college, I was still living in the same city. During my years at school, I was working at a nightclub as a bartender. After I was there for a few years, I took a position as the manager. Even though the money was less, I thought it would look better on my resume, and maybe it would lead to a better job in the future. I studied business in school, so it seemed to make sense. The club was one of the busiest spots in town. It was a large place, right on the corner of one of the main streets. The street-facing part of our building was just one large window, extending almost all the way to the ground. Inside, there were tables lining the side of the window. Past there, the bar was in the middle of the room, and on the far end, it was the dance floor. On a typical busy night, I had about 10 staff members under my supervision, 3 bartenders, 2 dishwashers, and at least 3 bussers. I had been working with some of them for a long time, and others were new. One Saturday night, as usual, the place was buzzing until the very last call. Eventually, we kicked out the last of the customers, and then I settled the night's earnings with the bartenders. They all left, and it was just past 3 in the morning. After that, I was alone, left with about a half hour of closing paperwork. There was an office at the back, but I didn't like it, so I chose a table near the large window at the front. I spread out the night's paperwork in front of me. The street outside was mostly quiet now, a stark contrast to the thumping music that had filled the nightclub just an hour ago. It was a routine wrap-up, marking the end of another hectic night. My ears were still ringing from the loud music. Suddenly, I heard the roar of an engine outside. I looked out the window and saw a car speed down the street. It was an older-looking car, maybe a Buick from the 90s. Of course, I couldn't tell for sure, because it was too fast. I saw a faint cloud of smoke linger under the street lamps after it passed. Then the sound faded, and I went back to work. But then I heard it again. It was coming back. It seemed like somebody was out joyriding in the middle of the night. Considering the circumstances, I thought it might have been a drunk driver. That kind of thing is all too common. My head snapped just as the noise got loud, and I heard the tires screech. Everything happened really fast after that. The headlights swung wildly towards the front window, blinding me. Before I could fully register what was happening, the car crashed through that front window. Glass shattered, spraying across the interior, like an explosion had just gone off. I quickly jumped up, pushing back from the table, my chair clattering to the floor. The car slammed to a halt just feet from where I had been sitting. I tripped over one of the tables behind me as I tried to get away. When I fell, I hurt my knee, but I managed to get back up quickly. I stood there for a second, staring at the car that had just barreled into the nightclub. Glass and debris were strewn all over. The engine was still running, so I was scared that he would start moving again. I took another step back. The driver's side window was down, and for the first time, I saw the person behind the wheel. The driver appeared dazed but conscious. It was clear that he was intoxicated because of how he was moving. Keeping a safe distance, I asked if he was okay and told him to stay put while I called for help. I dialed 911 and told them that we needed an ambulance right away. I couldn't tell if the driver was hurt, but it was definitely possible. I didn't see any blood, so maybe he was fine, but it was quite a crash. As I waited, I kept an eye on the driver, making sure he didn't try to flee the scene or anything. I told him not to move just in case he was hurt, because I heard somewhere that that's what you were supposed to do. He didn't try anything though, just sat there in the car and waited. The reality of how close it had been began to sink in, and I felt some anger for the driver. I was literally 15 or 20 feet away from getting crashed into by that car. After a few minutes, the police got there and came in. They were followed by paramedics who approached the car first. The driver of the car was still trapped in his seat, and he mumbled incoherently. I knew then that he was in trouble, because there's no way that anybody was going to believe that he was sober. An officer then approached me. After telling him what happened, I watched as the paramedics took the driver out of the car and loaded him onto a stretcher. He was taken to the hospital, but he was later arrested for driving under the influence and other charges. I was asked if I needed any medical attention, but I was fine, just shaken up by the close call. We had that window boarded up for a while, but eventually my boss had it fixed. I worked at that place for another few years after this happened, and for the rest of that time, I was scared to sit next to that window. Unlikely as it seems that anything else like that would happen, I was still scared. About 10 years ago, when I was 23, I got a job at a fast food place near where I was living at the time. I was mostly working the late shift by myself, because I was also doing an internship during the day. It paid basically nothing though, so I had to take the night shift job. It wasn't exactly the dream job I had in mind when I was studying at school, but it paid decently and it kept me busy. The restaurant was small, but it had a lot of regulars, most of whom were decent folks, and I liked seeing a few of them. But there was one guy who was a real piece of work. He came in almost every night, sometimes more than once. No one knew his name, but everyone knew he was a jerk. He was rude and often snapped at me and my coworkers over the smallest things, like a missed packet of ketchup, or he would just complain that we were too slow. He'd slam his fist on the counter and raise his voice. Every time he acted up, I had to ask him to leave. It got to the point where I could almost predict when he would start causing trouble. It was exhausting, but I dealt with it. It was part of the job, or so I told myself. One night, he came in as usual. It was around 11 p.m., and I was alone. The usual rush had died down, and I was preparing to close up. He staggered through the door and walked up to me, his eyes barely focusing as he murmured his order. I could tell that he had been drinking, but he wasn't that drunk. He wasn't falling all over the place or anything, so it wasn't enough to ask him to leave. I did look out into the parking lot, and I didn't see a car, so it seemed like he was probably not driving. Because of that, I was going to serve him and hope he left afterwards. I rang up his order and watched as he fumbled with his wallet, spilling a few coins onto the counter. He didn't shout or bang the counter this time. Instead, he slurred a quiet apology when he dropped the coins, which I picked up and handed back to him. It was the first time I had heard him say sorry for anything. After I handed him his tray, he went to one of the tables near the side window. I watched him from the corner of my eye as I wiped down other tables. About 10 minutes later, I noticed that he had started to doze off in his seat. I knew I couldn't just let him stay there like that, so I walked over and gently touched his shoulder. "Sir, are you okay?" I said. He snapped awake and looked confused for a moment, then he laid into me a bit. He was screaming about something that I couldn't understand. After a minute of that, I asked him to leave. This guy was a jerk, but he had never been violent to me before. This time he was really angry though, and I was feeling scared, especially because I was alone. Eventually, I got him out the door and locked it after he was gone. It was only 25 minutes to close, and I knew I could get in trouble for closing early, but I still think it was the best decision. I waited out the rest of the 25 minutes, and then I walked out to the parking lot. It was quiet, and I was the only one around, my car being the only one still there. I walked across the parking lot to where my car was. It was on the edge of the lot with a concrete divider right next to it. On the other side was the alley behind one of the other businesses. Just as I reached my car, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from my boss checking in. We would do that on the shifts when we worked alone. It wasn't company policy, but it was a safety thing. I typed back a quick reply saying that I was fine. Then I locked the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. I pulled out my keys, unlocked my car, and opened the driver's side door. As I was about to get in, I tossed my bag into the passenger seat. Right then, I was grabbed from behind. It was that customer that I had kicked out earlier. I didn't know where he came from, but he must have been hiding around there somewhere, maybe right behind my car. The guy yanked me away from my door, and I stumbled across the pavement. When I regained my balance, I saw that he was coming for me. I gripped my keys tight in case I needed to defend myself, but instead of fighting him, I ran. When I got to the other side of the parking lot, I turned around and saw that he was still coming, but he was slow. He was barely even running, more of a fast walk. I managed to get past him to the other side and made it to my car. Once I was inside, I locked my doors. The guy came at me and started banging on the window. I didn't even look at him, just drove away. I called my boss right after I got home, because he knew who the guy was. We did get the cops involved, and although charges were never laid, we banned him from the store for life.